All right, welcome back to Wrestling Retold and Relived by Richie Mars. I am, of course, your humble, gracious host, Richie Mars, and thank you for clicking on this episode. Took last week off because I had to mentally prepare for this topic today. Because a couple of weeks ago, I ran a poll on a couple options on future episodes, and they will be future episodes. But which one do people want to go for first? And of course, I chose either RK Bro, the Bullet Club Civil War, the Kevin Nash PCS tournament, and the worst of TNA. And it looked like it was going to be RK Bro or the Bullet Club Civil War. So I left the poll and I'm like, all right, cool. So I was mentally preparing for a happy episode. Of course, everyone wants to see me suffer, so the worst of TNA won out. So that's what we're doing today first. But I couldn't do this alone. I needed support emotionally, maybe spiritually, because this is gonna be a rough one. So I had to call in a favor. I had to. It's not the August 1 warning for those of you who got that reference. It is City of Wrestling, Nedrian 180. Sir, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, I had to join you. We were talking about this I think, a months ago.
Yeah.
We were talking about this on one of my TikTok lives, and it's funny that you did that poll because I would anticipate people wanted to talk about the Bullet Club Civil
Yeah.
War, and it's something about that era of TNA that's just, eh, oh my lord! And I have interesting memories during that time
Yeah.
period. I'm not gonna say which time period. But if you're talking about TNA and you say that time period, you pretty much got a good idea what time period it
Yeah,
is.
and the fact that the saying LOLTNA is a saying in the wrestling lexicon kind of describes what we're dealing with right here, because I'm not sure about you. Did you watch TNA since the beginning, its inception?
Oh yes, I remember. Okay, so oh man, now I'm dating myself, but I remember. So I'm in Chicago. I remember on the CBS 2 Chicago station at, and I want to say
Mhm.
weekends around. Oh man, I want to say 2, 3 in the morning, they would air the actual TNA commercial promoting the TNA
Oh
pay-per-views,
wow.
and my neighbor upstairs would always get
Mhm.
it. So it was 9.99. It was like, oh, cool, we could watch TNA, and they would air like the. I remember the first episode they aired, and then they would just keep looping it, and then of course each week they would add everything, so you could catch up on like a month's worth of TNA in one
That's
sitting.
pretty dope.
And I was like, "Oh, okay." And that was 2002, so I've watched it back then when they were in the Nashville and everything, and then of course when I remember watching a debut episode on Fox
Mhm.
Sports in the afternoon, and then of course I remember their first pay per view, Victory Road, which man, to me that's one of their best pay per views because of just how it flowed and everything. So yeah, I've been watching it since the beginning. Kind of fell off TNA around '07, not because it was boring
Mhm.
or anything, because I had a job and everything, and my schedule was
Right,
always
yeah.
sporadic. And of course, back then in '08, you didn't have DVR and social media the way it is now. So it was like, okay, I missed the episode. Where can I find it? And you didn't have any alternative links
No, yeah.
to
Legal
watch
alternative links.
pro
Yeah.
wrestling. Yes. Yes.
Meh.
Um, but then I started watching late 2009, and then of course 2010 was like, oh wow, they got Hogan and Bish. I'm like, didn't expect that to happen. It's like, all right, let me check in and watch that. And of course, I went to a TNA event in like March of 2010. But then after that, it just like I'm just like, man, I can do something better. Like, you know what? I'm in broadcasting school. Let me just focus on broad. Like, it was just like wow, this is crazy. And of course, during that time, I my buddy put me on New Japan, the Bullet
Mhm.
Club, and Ring of Honor. So my attention went from WWE TNA to WWE Ring of Honor, New Japan. Yeah, I'll catch a little bit of what the hell is happening on
Yeah.
TNA, and that's how it. evolved and everything.
Yeah, for me, for TNA, I started watching when they were in the Spike TV era, where they just joined Spike TV, like legit. Like I think it was like
Okay.
less than a month after WWE left Spike TV, and like basically, if you guys don't know what Spike TV is, basically, you get a blender, right, and you throw in Axe body spray, Affliction T-shirts, Mansers, a hundred, like 1,000 ways to die, uh
Spencer's.
Spencer's, let's Quiznos, like all of that, like in there,
Yeah.
5 Hour Energy, Monster Energy, just like all that, and that's basically what Spike TV. It was the man channel they
Oh,
promoted.
you forgot the MXM challenge, the obstacle
Oh
course. Do you remember that show
yeah,
that used to air
yeah,
on Spike TV? It's
yeah.
on Tubi TV.
Oh,
The whole all the
oh, now
episodes.
I know what I'm gonna watch when when we get off of here.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That was everybody's go-to on that network.
yeah, but it's like they were at Universal, and they had the Impact Zone before, like in Nashville, they were in the Asylum. Then it's the
Yeah.
Impact Zone, and just seeing like all these different guys. I remember the first person because it was kind of cool because TNA was like the first promotion to really utilize the internet to their advantage, and they had like a poll on which wrestler you wanted to see in the first match of Spike TV, and AJ Styles got the nod, I think, against Roderick Strong. So it's just like, oh, cool. Like it was a little different, interactive. Of course, the 6-sided ring. That's how they got the
Oh,
toy deal. You know,
yeah.
and
I don't know what I did with that. I had that
I,
freaking
I
ring.
remember I got like a Shark Boy action figure and a Jeff Hardy action figure. But the thing is, it's like this was during the Jack Pacific era of action figures. So it's like they always look like so
Gotcha.
tiny. But I'm just like, I just want Jeff and Matt team together, and so I had to wait a little bit longer. But the whole thing with TNA, and it was really the little promotion that could for a while, because a lot of people, since WCW was defunct and bought out by WWF, a lot of people were trying to still find that alternative, because WWE, WWF at that time, it was wrestling how they saw it, which is fine. It works for some people, and some people can only look through that lens, which I don't fault them on. It's kind of like you're
Yeah.
raised to, like, if you're raised on WWF, you're gonna like prefer WWF stuff. But the wrestling fan of just like, like the southern gritty, progressive independent style wasn't being displayed in WWE at that time. Like, I think at that time period, the only independent wrestler that was signed was Punk for WWE. Like around that
Yeah.
05, 06 era.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
You know what? Yeah. Yeah, it was Punk, and then a few years later, that was when Brian Danielson popped up. Like, oh, I think
yeah,
07 or
like
something like that.
like
Oh
08,
eight.
09, and like around there.
Yeah, it was that weird transition from like ECW
Yeah.
to NXT. That
Yeah,
weird
yeah.
period in OVW to FCW, like that
It was
whole
such a like an
thing that they
odd
were
like
transitioning.
transition for everybody. And with TNA, they had like the golden ticket to like capitalize on what's going on in the independents, because it was like TNA, and for I'm not sure if they were really in competition, but it's like TNA, Ring of Honor. Those are the two promotions within US that were gaining traction. With Ring of Honor doing like a per show thing, like the old ECW, and TNA, they
Yeah.
actually had financial backing behind them, with Dixie Carter, with Panda Energy, with all of that. But going into TNA's, before we get to the lowlights, let's do a little bit of like the positives. The X Division, of course, being their like main contribution.
Oh,
And for those of you who don't know the X Division, shame on you. But essentially, it's like, I hate saying like they were
man.
like the cruiserweights of TNA, because the X Division was so much more than like a weight limit kind of thing. It was about no limits. And when people's like, what does that mean? Where it's like, it was a certain style of wrestling where it was high paced, fast action, but you didn't need to be, the standard like cruiserweight size guy. You could have Samoa Joe in there. You could have Brian Cage in there. You could have all these different guys that perfected the independent style at that time period. And I think it's very important to just like kind of like put like a stamp on that, because that's how I think PWG like really became popping off, because PWG was a lot of like, X Division style. and stuff.
Yeah.
Like so like X Division, the Knockouts, they were the first promotion to really push the women as like wrestlers to be respected and actually have their division in there, just like promoting, and their segments would outdraw the guys too, so much so like there was talk of the TNA having a knockouts only show, and they were the first ones to do like the women's tag titles, all that. So I like TNA, for all its like faults that we're gonna get into, uh patience, like they did some like good things. So D, what things do you remember of TNA that you think deserve to be on that like pro list?
Oh man. Definitely the X division. I remember. So, give you a timeline. I'm gonna probably reveal
Hmm.
my age and everything. So when TNA came into existence, which was
Hmm.
2002, when they were launched and everything, I was 20 years
Mm,
old. So it was literally right a year after um or actually was it 2000? Yeah, it was 2002 they
yeah.
launched and everything. But it was like a year after that whole WCW, ECW was bought and everything. And I can tell you from living through it, that launch period and everything, like just the wrestling scene and just wrestling fans, like it was just a somber
Hmm.
time. Like you had WWE and everything, but it was just somber because it was just like, I was 20 years old, but I grew up with WCW. I saw ECW rise and everything. So now it's just only WWE, and it's just like, this is just weird. And then when TNA launched, it was like, oh, okay, we got an alternative
Hmm.
finally. Because it was more of it wasn't like tribalistic as you see now
Right.
and everything. It was just more like in my case and a lot of wrestling fans like, man, we don't want to see one company. We want to see two and three. Like we just like we want to see more than just
Hmm.
one. And that was just an adamant feeling amongst most wrestling fans. So when TNA came on and the X division, and man, that X division, I always said, I was like, yo, if there is a spiritual successor to the WCW Cruiserweight, which freaking were bangers on Nitro, I'm like, it was those. I'm like, those when they like AJ Styles and Petey Williams, I'll never forget that match at Victory
Hmm.
Road where you saw the Canadian Destroyer that everybody does now, which they didn't do a lot of back then.
Yeah.
And I remember him doing. I'm like, this should have been the main event. This should have been. And I think that's one thing. Um, I wish they would have tweaked. In retrospect, you can always do that. Is I wish they would have combined the world title and the X Division title, where because at that time people saw the X Division as a cruiserweight
Hmm.
division. It isn't like you see it like, oh my god, no limits. They actually presented it more like their own
Yeah.
cruiserweight. So it really didn't feel as elevated as it should
Mhm.
because most of those guys in the cruiserweight division wound up being TNA
Mhm.
champions, and it's complete opposite of WCW cruiserweight. So I wish they would have done that, but no, the X division was great. Six sided ring was amazing because it was foreign to anyone who only watched
Mhm.
WWE. If you watched, and at that time in America and states and everything, you had exposure to Mexican wrestling. So I believe it was Triple A that you could watch that you saw the six sided ring. But it was like, oh, that's just their thing. But TNA were the ones that actually modernized it and made it mainstream. Like, hey, this is a six sided ring. It's like, yo, wait a minute, I gotta watch this, which really emphasized on their unique selling point on the launch, for the
Mhm.
launch, because it made it unique. It didn't make it like, oh, it's the standard four box, and oh, this is a new promotion. Like, what was Hogan's promotion, the UWF or something like that?
XWF.
X, yeah, XWF. That was only on for like I think 2 episodes and everything at 3 in the
Mhm.
morning on a Saturday or something. Um, so it was just unique. Of course, when it evolved and everything, was it the lockdown pay per view was really cool,
Every
where
match
every
being a
match
cage.
was in a steel
Yeah,
cage.
do you,
I thought that was cool. I'm like, yo, that's pretty
yeah, I
dope.
did like that.
But then
Yeah.
after a while, if you're watching it, like after like the third match, you're just like, man, can they? I remember I was watching one of my buddies. I'm like, man, can they like take the cage out for this match because it's like kind of getting
Yeah,
redundant
and it's like they would
and
be using
everything.
the cage, they'd just be working a normal match, but inside like the cage dressing. So it's like the cage wasn't
Yeah.
really there. Do you know the story on how Lockdown became to be like the show?
Oh man, I vaguely
So,
remember how they came about.
so Christopher Daniels, I got this from a shoot interview. So Jerry Jarrett was in like a creative meeting, and they're like, everyone's like, "All right, this is a cage, this is a cage, and this is a cage match." And Jerry Jarrett's like, "Well, hell, why don't we just throw all the matches in a cage?" Like, being frustrated, and people in the creative are like, "Aha! Yes, we love it." And Jerry's like, "No, no, that's not what I meant." But they did it anyway. So that's how Lockdown became
Yeah.
an every cage match pay per view. And I think they switched it like later down the line. I think this was during the Hogan Bischoff era, where it was only like one match was a steel cage.
Yeah. Yeah, because it when you watch the paper, like it was. Don't get me wrong. Like the first lockdown was pretty cool because again, this was innovative. The
Hmm.
first lockdown, the first Ultimate
Hmm.
X match. That whole like it was just a lot of innovative things. I was like,
Hmm.
okay, this is an alternative to
Hmm.
WWE.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, cool. Um, but yeah, once after a while, like visually, you just got like, okay, this isn't
Mhm.
different. Like, can you change it and everything? But man, I really liked how they were how do I put this? The man, I'm forgetting the word. I like how what they did with the
Mhm.
knockouts division.
Progressive.
Like they really showcased the yeah, progressive and they really showcased the women's wrestling. Granted, it was like a hybrid of like the Attitude
Mhm.
Era and what they were trying to do. So a lot of it was just like,
Mhm.
yeah, you're progressive, but yeah, this has elements of like the Attitude Era, ECW,
Mhm.
WWE thing. Is like,
So I'm glad you brought.
all
I'm
right,
glad you brought up the knockouts division and like the match types too, because that actually goes into like this is like my worst match ever, not only in TNA, just ever. Like this is like the stipulation that I hate with a passion the most. I've gone on rants about this, and now I finally get to talk about it in a podcast setting, so I'm very excited. Obviously, as you could tell by the tone of my voice, it is the Knockouts Lockbox Challenge. If you remember that.
oh man, I haven't heard. Man, I haven't heard. I remember the
Mhm.
name. I I vaguely remember the
All right,
stipulation.
so let me refresh your memory. This
Yes,
is
please
this is
do.
an 8-woman tag team match. All right, so 4 knockouts on one side,
Okay.
4 knockouts on the other side. All right. If you're at home listening, pull out your whiteboard. This is going to get very messy very quickly. So, there are 4 falls in this match. So, let's say a person from team A pins somebody from team B. The person on team A who got the pinfall gets a key, and the person on team B is eliminated. But both of them would go out of the match because person on team A got a key. So then it becomes a 6
Yeah.
woman knockouts tag match. And the person from team B could pin team A, and then so on and so forth until there's 4 keys that are given out. And what are in these, what the keys are for, these lock boxes that contain different prizes. And the prizes are as follows: a contract for a future Knockouts Women's Championship match,
Okay.
Tara's pet spider, Poison. Oh no, wait, we're still going. Uh,
I know where this
yep,
headed.
the TNA Knockouts Women's Championship,
Okay.
and an obligation to perform a striptease.
That this sounds like Russo all like this sounds like Vince
Oh,
Russo.
it's
His
I wouldn't be
creative.
surprised. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think he was
yeah, this was like
writing
oh
at that time.
nine 2010, like around there.
Yeah, if I remember from a shoot interview that Nash gave, I believe he was I don't know if he was there at that time, but I know Nash and Cornette were like butting heads with Russo. Just like, huh? Like if I vaguely remember that. I could be
Yeah.
wrong or what have you, but yeah, that like two of those stipulations made
Mhm.
sense. The other ones, like, why?
Yeah, so Tara was the Knockouts champion going into that match. And it was like the beautiful people stole her spider. So the people that won, and
Yeah.
I think this is when Angelina Love was out of the beautiful people, technically. So the winners were uh, Velvet, Angelina, Tara, and Daphne. So Velvet won the contract for a future Knockouts Women's Championship match. Tara won her spider back, which means she lost the Knockouts Championship. Angelina won the Knockouts Championship, and Daphne had to perform a striptease in the ring,
That's
which
Russo.
which didn't occur because I believe something happened. Somebody attacked Daphne, or like Daphne attacked somebody. Like it didn't end up happening, But it was just like this was the main event of the TNA Impact show. Like
Okay, what year was that they did
I
that?
think 2009, 2010. It has. I believe it was before Hogan and Bischoff came in.
Yeah, because I know, man, God rest
Yeah.
her soul, man. She was a
Oh my
great
gosh.
character,
Yes.
Daphne. I remember the episode that I went to in March of 2010 in Florida. She actually suffered an injury in the one of the tapings,
Oh yeah. Was that when she got
and
busted
I think
open
she
that
got
one time in the back of the head or something?
busted open. I think it was her neck or
Okay.
something, where they had to cart her out and everything. They actually had her on like the stretcher
Mhm.
and wheeled her out and
Oh my
everything.
gosh.
Um, so I think it was. I don't know if that was around the same time or
Mhm.
anything, because they were notorious for like writing people
Yeah.
off and oh, they're injured. We're gonna like it was just like
Speaking of which, you just reminded me when RVD was the TNA champion. They were coming up on his dates because like his contract, he only wrestled a certain amount of dates, so he was coming up on them, but he was still TNA champion. So how they wrote him off was Abyss had this like 2x4 with nails in it called Janice, and just just murdered RVD on television at the end of like I believe they called it the whole effing show special,
God,
and like RVD is
yeah,
just he's like in a pool, like a comedic like pool of his own blood, where it's just like it looked like he got like the new blood when they would like bloodbath people or gangrel with blood, but it looked like
yeah.
that, but it's just like with the nails and like Abyss just like
That
hopping,
had to be
like it
Russo.
was just like a lot of
That
that,
I
yeah.
believe. Yeah, I believe Russo was there. I don't maybe from the beginning, but I know he was there from like 2000 and like right before Bischoff
Yeah,
came.
well, this was during Bischoff.
'Cause-
Like, and Vince Russo was
Yeah,
still
it's
in like TNA with Bischoff and stuff. So it's like
yeah.
it's so like bizarre because it's like Hogan, Bischoff, and Russo were all like at least in a creative sense were a part of WCW declining, and they all said, "Up, let's try round two with all this combination."
Oh my God, and that's the thing. Like, um, with wrestling fans now when they criticize like AEW and their creative, like I lived through like the 2000
Hmm.
WCW. That was
Yeah,
horrible. Mind you, I didn't watch it
mhm.
weekly, like live. I saw the recap show.
Mm,
And even watching a recap show, because I mean, my
yeah,
history
yeah, yeah.
watching wrestling and everything. Like, I knew right away, I'm like, there's something off with this show. Like, this is just weird.
Whenever somebody
Like,
comes to me or comments on one of my videos saying, "Oh, this is just as bad or worse than WCW 2000 or TNA like in 2010," I'm like, you weren't in the trenches during that time. That's how I know you weren't
oh my
watching it.
lord.
Like that's how I know people weren't
I'll
watching
give
it.
you I'll give you a history. So I went to the TNA in
Mhm.
2010, but I went to one of the last. Actually, I went to the last Monday Nitro slash Thunder shows in Chicago,
Mhm.
and that was October 2010. It was a double
Mhm.
taping. I kid you not. Not even TNA in its worst period was like
Mhm.
that. Like it was just like, man, it was
Mhm.
weird. Nothing really. There wasn't a rhyme, a tempo to
Yeah,
the
no
show.
synergy.
Yeah, it was just the only cool thing was the I don't know if you remember the show
Oh
Biodome.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I was at that episode with Terry Crews. Yes, Terry Crews, the famous actor, was there. That was pretty cool. But it just didn't. It didn't feel like I always like it didn't feel
Yeah.
entertainment. Like man, I came here to like be
Yeah.
entertained. It just felt
A
very
chore.
like, well, we're here to put
Yeah.
this on, and it was just like,
It's the
ew,
equivalent
like
of like hosting a Super Bowl party, but instead of watching the Super Bowl, you're seeing somebody like jingle their keys in front of your face for like an hour and a half. And
yeah,
it's just like,
or like
eh,
or like going to a Super Bowl party and instead of watching the Super
eh,
Bowl, they're playing it on Madden.
yeah.
You're like, what the? Like, no, I want to watch. What are you doing? I want to watch. Like, no, we're. It's like, oh,
Yeah,
man, but it was just
yeah,
really um
and
bad, and it's unfortunate because when Russo, Bischoff, and Hogan were there, and I remember watching that first episode he did. We can get into that a little
mhm,
later, but just the vibe of
mhm.
it just felt so much like WCW 2000. I'm just like,
Yeah, we're gonna get to
"Ew,"
that.
like,
There's still like a lot of match types that like I still like are burned in my core memory that I'm just like, how did they get away with this? Like there was one. Do you remember the Doomsday Chamber of Blood match?
man, you know what? That had what year
That
was
was
that?
2007.
Yeah, around 2007. So just to give you some historical context, because I did keep
Hmm.
up with it, but I didn't watch it.
Right.
So I would watch like to read the results and everything. So around 2007, I remember I was working at a restaurant in Cicero. So like my hours to watch availability, like I think back then it used to come on Thursdays. Did it used to come
Yeah.
on Thursday? Yeah, I think it came on Thursday. And usually Thursdays I was freaking working a double.
Mm,
So it's like, and again, there was no replay or anything. That was the other thing that I think they made another mistake. There was no
mm.
replays. So it was like you couldn't watch the replay or anything. So it was just like, ah, crap. Let me read the results or what have you. So, but no, I do not remember that match. But please refresh my
So,
memory. I
so,
remember the reading the results.
so pretty much Abyss, and like this was the time period where Abyss was under Sting's wing, and Sting was trying to free Abyss, calling him Chris every other like word, trying to remember who he is. So it was Christian Cage, I believe it was yeah, it was Christian Cage, AJ Styles, and Tomko versus Abyss, Sting, and the Punisher, Andrew Martin, better known as Test.
Oh God, I remember that.
So,
I remember him in TNA.
so this was his only match that he was a part of, and there's a reason why they let him go. And it's I will tell you the reason after. But the Doomsday Chamber of Blood match, it was a six-sided steel cage with barbed wire on top of it, and you couldn't pin somebody until they were bleeding.
Oh my lord, that's Vince
Do you
Russo.
want to know the real kicker?
What's the kicker?
Abyss pinned AJ, and AJ wasn't bleeding.
Yeah, that's
Eh,
Russo. That's
which is
Russo.
also the same. I believe
That's
it's the year after was Cuffed to the Cage match, where it was 12 tag teams. I believe it was 12 tag teams, and you had to cuff everybody to like inside the steel cage to the steel cage, and the
oh my
winner would
lord.
be the last team or person that wasn't cuffed to the cage.
Oh my
And the
lord.
story about
You can
yeah,
you can tell by the just those two match types you just mentioned. You can tell that like the creative decline of TNA just was like that 2008 2009 it was steadily
yeah,
going
yeah.
down and then it's like, "Wait, we're going to bring Hogan and Bischoff. They're going to bring it up." And it
Mm.
just went,
Wait.
"Wee- woo!"
It's like that. I mean, but wait, there's more. And they got all
Oh
that. And
god.
so
Oh.
there was the electrified steel cage match, uh,
I think
where
I
it was
remember that
LAX
watching it.
versus Team 3D. And every time somebody like hit the steel cage, you'd just hear like this wonky, like out of sync, wow, 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 just like, and they have to pretend like they got shocked or electrocuted. But the story about Andrew Martin was he was during the time where the Benoit stuff happened. So they let
Yeah.
him go because wrestling was getting pushed back because of steroid stuff, and
Yeah.
TNA thought it wasn't a great idea to have somebody on their roster that looked like they were pretty heavily using at that point,
Yeah.
and which is unfortunate.
I think was it not too long after that he unfortunately
He
like
passed away in
unalived himself.
2009. Like I think it was an accidental overdose, I believe. It
Yeah,
would,
and man, he was one of my
yeah, he
favorite
was he was
wrestlers
so
too.
talented too.
Yeah,
But
yeah. TNA they were doing like it was just like after like they got to
mhm,
Spike. I want to say maybe a year or two
mhm.
after they just started doing some
They were
like
just throwing stuff at the wall to see what was happening. Like they did
yeah,
the reverse battle royal, which I get reminded of daily when I talk about TNA, which is So
Oh
the
my
story of the
lord, I
reverse
remember
battle
watching that.
royal is that I believe this was for a tournament where it was just like so like there's 8 people that would qualify to be a part of this tournament, I believe. 8 or 9 people or 12. It was a number. But everybody would start fighting on the outside and you had to go inside the ring in order to qualify for this tournament. So whoever like got in would be a part of the bracket or something like that. But it would start on the outside and the winners would have to be on the inside. And then after that, then the bell would ring and the seating is determined by the elimination order of people getting thrown over the top rope. So if that sounds
Oh my
confusing,
god, that's
it does. Basically, you start
it's
outside to get into the ring, then a battle royal starts to throw people out of the ring, and then all of that leads to a tournament.
I I remember the advertisement for that show, and I wanted to see it. I was like, reverse battle royal. I'm like, how the hell does that work?
It doesn't.
And was I think a couple, I think last year, it was either Kevin Nash's podcast or Jim Cornette's podcast. They were discussing, and they're like, this made no sense whatsoever. Like, the logic is like, okay, you get thrown in the ring, but no, wait, there's more. You got to get thrown.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, huh? Like, it was just, man, that. Oh man, yeah. By that time, I was really like just you know checking on TNA
Mhm.
in and out, but like few stuff, I was just like,
Yeah.
this is like really
Yeah.
weird,
And
man.
then there was the last rights match, which is there was a coffin in the middle of the ring. It was either hanging first and then you have to call for the coffin to like be in the ring, but it's like it was something like the coffin was in the ring and you have to throw your opponent in it. And this is where the infamous Fire Russo chants happened in this match right here.
Man, that
I feel
like, did he have these ideas like on Rough Draft or something, like on his
I
laptop
feel
or
like
something?
because this was during the time period around this time, WSX was a thing. If you remember that Wrestling Society X,
Yeah.
I feel like because they had like
Yes. Oh, I love
they
that
had
show.
all these off. Like I think like they had like a piranha tank match or something like that, and they were just like throwing like all these
Yeah.
extreme like over the top stipulations at the wall. But I feel like Russo
Yeah.
or whoever was the creative team at that point was just like, let's try all these things, but let's make it presentable for television or pay per view. And then it just kind of like spiraled. It was just like the whole entire like TNA experience was a fever dream. Like there's things that I absolutely love about TNA. Introduced me to some of my favorites like AJ Styles, Chris Sabin, Alex Shelley, all that. And then it just kind of like it got like weird. And speaking of weird, let's talk about like our storylines that we remember from there. The worst storylines that we've that we've heard in the past. One of the ones that is very prominent with me when talking about bad TNA storylines is when Samoa Joe got kidnapped by ninjas. Now they weren't like classic ninjas because they were wearing cargo pants or cargo shorts,
Oh
but
my
they
lord.
like Samoa Joe was a heel at the time. He was doing the Nation of Violence thing where he gave himself a buzz cut.
I remember the Nation of
Yeah, had
Violence
like the
thing.
face paint on there. And then like he gets abducted in like this ice cream truck like van and they just shove him in. The next week they like shoot a promo of him like sweating. Like he looked like he was like in a sauna or a sweat box and he was like he was making it believe that he was being tortured, which like I'm like okay. And then he came back like nothing happened because apparently no, this is the rumor I was told that he came back as a babyface, and the reason why he came back as a babyface was because they didn't have enough baby faces on the roster.
That sounds like Russo, and everything you're telling me. Um, a lot of like Jim Cornette and Kevin Nash have like talked about, and it's just like that makes no sense. I know for me, one of the storylines that I really like, it really didn't make any sense was not the main event Mafia, the damn group that Hogan
Immortal,
had. Yeah, that group. I'm like, this makes no sense. And then of course with the Aces of
Aces and
Eights,
Eights, yeah.
I'm like, this is trying to be Sons of Anarchy, but it's bad. Like this is horrible. like, there's one thing, like, you get inspired by
Yeah,
TV
yeah,
shows. Like, we've had gimmicks in wrestling be inspired by
yeah.
TV shows, but, like, I'm like, I can't like, the only good thing was, like, Bubba Ray was actually a really good
Hmm.
heel, but it was just, like, everything around it was just, like, "This is so corny, like, this makes no sense." The Brooke Hogan thing, I'm
Yeah.
like,
So,
"Why?
eh,
This
li-
make
like the thing
huh?"
is, it's one thing to be inspired by TV, but it's like if it's like a direct ripoff, a lot of people won't take to it as well. Like I feel like with Robbie
Exactly.
E, because they had like Robbie E and Cookie for a little bit, where it's like Jersey Shore was a poppin'
Yeah.
thing. And the funny thing about that is they had Jay Wow, they had Ronnie too, but Jay Wow guest appeared. Like I think they paid her like $15,000 or something to appear, but their show was happening the same time slot and day of Jersey Shore. So why would people watch TNA Impact to see JWoww when they could just watch her like when
Yeah.
Jersey Shore's at its peak? But like Robbie E made a good career because he kind of like transitioned out of like the stereotypical
Yeah.
Jersey Shore thing. Though the most like incredulous to me, so bad that it fractured, like it helped fracture the relationship between TNA and New Japan at the time, was Okada. And let me take you back in time, ladies and gentlemen. 2011, the Seth Rogen superhero movie, I'm going to say that again, the Seth Rogen superhero movie of the Green Hornet, movie that was in developmental hell for years and years. It was about Seth Rogen, rich kid who inherits a paper company and has a best friend slash bodyguard slash servant named Kato, who would like do all the work for him, this, that, and the other thing. So Vince Russo's idea was to take. They were like New Japan were like, all right, Kazuchika Okada, we want him to learn as much as he can, and then like they'll do excursion, then they'll go back to New Japan. So they made Okada a ripoff of Kato, and they called him Okato, where he became Samoa Joe's like, I don't know what he was like a videographer, like a sidekick, and like they even tried to like, I think he was feuding with Pulp at the time, and the story goes that Okada was super uncomfortable because they wanted him to blade in like one and it wasn't needed at all.
Yeah.
And so the Young Bucks, like, and like other X Division guys with Okada, like, explain, like, look, he's uncomfortable with this. And they're like, oh yeah, yeah, just if you're feeling comfortable with something, like, speak up. Wasn't used again, and it got like so bad that and Okada gives TNA credit that that experience taught him he needed a character to connect with the large matches of the
Yeah.
audience, which we got the Rainmaker from it. So I guess it turned out to be good in the end, but the fact that it's just like, all right, here's a movie that's going to be hot for like a month, maybe. And that's being generous because that's the Hornet starring
Yeah.
Seth Rogen.
Yeah.
But it's,
It was a complete different from the one in the was it the
yeah.
'60s with Bruce Lee?
Yeah. So it's just like they had like a golden opportunity with all this talent, but it's like the worst characters, worst storylines for that like
Yeah.
era. And Immortal, like you said, was people like, and you could criticize the Death Riders. I think it's like the Death Riders, like they are what they are. Like I don't really feel that much excitement when I watch the Death Riders, but it's like at least now as we're recording this, it's going somewhere. With the whole Cope stuff, with
Yeah.
just like development between the group. I feel like it's one of those like I'm gonna hit randomize on my 2K to see who I'm gonna put in the faction, and let's see what if it works or not. And I feel like a lot of
Yeah.
like some members work, some don't, but that's again personal preference. My my opinion is not the be all end all. But Immortal was like, let's take half the roster and just
Oh my
heels
yes.
that don't have any synergy together. Because you had Hogan, Abyss, Fortune, which was AJ, Beer Money, Kazarian, and they split off later. But like they started with that Jeff Hardy, uh, Jeff Jarrett, Bully Ray, Scott Steiner. Uh,
I'm trying to think of who. Well, you could throw Gallows in because I think he was
I'm gonna
still
look
there at
this
the
up right
time.
now. But yeah,
But yeah,
you had all these
I
people.
remember that period because it just, again, me being an old school
Yeah.
fan and everything, I'm just like, man, Bischoff and Hogan are trying to recreate the
All right.
NWO. Like they're trying to recreate this, and it just, I never. it never clicked with
Yeah.
me because it just didn't make
Oh, I
sense.
got him here. We got
All
Gunner
right.
Murphy, Garrett
Okay.
Bischoff, who was Jackson James. He was the referee for their Immortal. Rob Terry, Matt Hardy, Karen Jarrett, Tommy Dreamer. Oh, that was only for like a storyline. Uh,
Hmm.
Chris Harris, that was for a storyline. Mr. Anderson, briefly for a month. And Kurt Angle was a part of Immortal, like at the very tail end.
Oh Lord, man.
So a lot of like names of just like, here's the bad guy faction. And it's one of those things where, and I put a video on this, where I feel like wrestling, I'm fatigued with heel factions, being the most dominant of the storyline. I think that's what some of
Mm-hmm.
my problems go with not only the Death Riders, but like the Bloodline story too, because the Bloodline has jumped the shark so many times. It's like I'm watching the rerun of Fonzie when he actually jumped the shark. But it's like the purpose of the heel group is to build baby faces and kind of solidify them as, hey, this is our guy, this is what we want as the centerpiece of the show. But Immortal, it was just like Hogan's the name, and it's just going to be Hogan, which was like, oh, all right. And this
Yeah.
was during the period where I believe like they were trying to make Bobby Roode the solo star, but then Hogan went on a radio show and said Bobby Roode's not that guy. And then James Storm won for like a day, and then Bobby Roode turned heel. So it's not like there was like a transition from, it's like, all right, we're going to Immortal to the next top babyface. We're going to
Yeah.
Immortal, then we're going to heel Bobby Roode. So not saying Bobby Roode didn't deserve to be the world champion, but it's just like how he got there was just like very exhausting. It was like exhausting watching the show. I think that's the best way to put it. When Immortal was first created, the show after,
Yeah.
the first segment took 30 minutes, and each they didn't have like a legit match until like, I think like an hour in.
Oh Lord. Yeah, I remember. If you remember the post that I shared with you that one day and everything, it was around
Mhm,
that time. And when I tuned in, I think the episode that you're talking about, like it was 30 minutes. I remember watching because I was able to
mhm,
watch it because I was in broadcasting school, so I my Thursdays were
mhm,
free and everything. So I'm watching. I'm just like I'm looking. Like I always pay attention to the
mhm.
crowd. Like, okay, how's the crowd reacting? How's it connecting with the crowd? Because I'm like, if there's a lively crowd, you as a viewer, you get into it because like, hey, if they're into it, I'm gonna get
Mhm.
into it. Case in point, the past couple weeks of
Yep.
Dynamite, just been like, yo, this crowd, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And man, I remember watching, and I'm like, man, this is boring. There's no life. It's lethargic. And mind you, at that time, I mean, they were having Samoa Joe, Sting, like the roster was
Mhm.
stacked. And I'm like, there is a problem creative when you have that much talent and the crowd is just,
And what's even worse was, I think this was still the time where they were, I'm not sure if they were on the road or they were still doing like primarily their tapings on the Impact Zone. And the Impact Zone, it's like they wanted to. I know Bischoff said he wanted to get out of the Impact Zone because visually it's just the same people there and they've seen it all before, which is, again, decent point. However, they weren't, they didn't have enough money at the time to start touring or anything like that, because there was a market for TNA, like for different places, which is why they would start doing like live events or house shows. But like
yeah.
the TNA fans, it's like they're the most like, if you remember like the NXT fans, if you remember like now AEW fans, they are loyal. The Ring of Honor fans, PWG, they are the most loyal like fans to their brand to a fault, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
when Bischoff and Hogan came in and brought in their guys, the Nasty Boys, they brought in Sean Morley, they brought in
Oh,
Orlando
God.
Jordan, they brought
You-
in.
You're bringing back some very bad
Well, that's what the
memories.
podcast is about. We gotta like go through
I,
the worst of it.
I
Uh,
know. I remember that. I remember those guys popping up.
um,
I'm like,
the band.
"Ugh."
Do you remember the band?
Oh my
The
lord.
band is back
What's
together.
funny about I think the best way to describe that era and how they miscalculated
Hmm.
creatively and just had some of the most ill-advised and just bad
Hmm.
creative is that first episode that Hogan debuted. People forget. I don't know what they were thinking by moving to Monday nights, but all Vince McMahon had to do, hey, Brett, you want to reconcile with Sean? You ain't been on TV for like, was it 2010,
Yeah.
13 years? Show up.
So that was like a Monday special. So they didn't start going live on Mondays until like they got the rating, and the rating was very impressive for them. I think they got over like a million. Like
Yeah.
everybody was like happy. Like Spike was like, "Oh, we this was better than we thought it would." And then and Bischoff said he didn't come up with the idea, but he supported the idea for the transfer for Monday. So I'll shed him like some of the blame, but not total the blame. But people in TNA they wanted to switch to Mondays because okay, this worked before, so why don't we do it every Monday? Uh Here's the thing: when they switched to Mondays, not only did they get trounced, their replays that would happen on Thursdays of the same show would get higher numbers than what happened on Monday. And then they kind of had
Yep.
to tuck their tail between the legs and say, due to fan demand, we're going back to Thursdays. It's like,
And it's like, I remember reading that and I was like, dude, there ain't no fandom, man. Freaking idiots move. Like, because I remember there was a few articles that I read. And I remember at that time, again, you didn't have like the content
mhm.
creation that you
Yeah,
have
yeah,
now and everything. And I remember reading a few articles. I remember my buddies in the broadcasting school were like, all they had to do was have that first show on Monday and then just drive traffic to
yeah. Hmm.
Thursday. Because we're like, again, at that time in context, historical context in 2010, like WWE was really entrenched on being the only
Hmm.
show. Like there was no exposure to New
Hmm.
Japan unless you again trade DV actually not tape trade, but like
Hmm.
DVD trade and stuff like that, and you scoured the internet or what have you. So they were entrenched in there. So trying to compete with WWE at that time, it was just like, dude, what the hell are you thinking? Like
Hmm.
you got to have like the right
Hmm.
balance to make that move. And they didn't have the
Nah.
balance. And it's like, oh, Hulk Hogan's here. And at that
Mhm.
time, if you remember in 2010, he like another miscalculated thing about TNA, they brought in Hogan to like be this big thing. And I remember
Mhm.
at that time, it came off the heels of his freaking reality
Mhm.
show, which in turn led to the whole divorce
Yeah,
thing and
yeah,
that whole thing. So he came in with some baggage and
yeah,
bad energy,
yeah.
and that just
This was right
snowballed
after
everything.
he because there was a point where he was thinking about ending it, you know what I mean? And then that was in like 2008, 2009. And
Yeah.
then it's like he was just coming off the mend a little bit, and Hogan said that he wouldn't join TNA unless Bischoff, oversaw his creative and stuff. And the thing about TNA during this time, and I read Bischoff's second book on this whole experience, where it just kind of seemed like everything is just like the thing is, anytime I read a book on like TNA during that time, it's always everyone pointing the finger at everybody else. It's never like no one like had a bad
It's
idea.
I take responsibility for
It's
it.
just like even like Bruce Pritchard, like Eric Bischoff. Read Al Snow's book, where it's just like the people in the office in TNA probably didn't know what they were doing either, but it was just like that combined with the creative end where it's like they're trying to make TNA WWE light, and they got rid of the six-sided ring. They changed it to TNA to Impact Wrestling, and then like all these things they were kind of taking away what made TNA TNA, you know? And I feel
Hmm.
like because originally the TNA acronym was, Vince Russo created because I'll give you three guesses why Vince Russo loved the term TNA as
Yeah, it's like,
section.
oh wow.
He also made the faction at the time in TNA SEX, which is Sports Entertainment Extreme, which was, immortal for that time period.
Oh Lord, that was so
Yeah.
stupid.
So
Don't forget the dancers.
there seems to be a theme with this subject right now and what's going on with TNA. I can't put my finger on it, but with just TNA in general and Bischoff and Hogan, it was like we're trying to make things that were WWE approved, but you didn't need WWE approval. And one of the worst storylines, as we're still going for storylines. So Hogan had the Hall of Fame ring with him, and he bestowed the Hall of Fame ring, the WWE Hall of Fame ring, to Abyss, and then Abyss got like magic powers from the ring.
Oh god, I remember
And
that.
the thing is, it's like this is before the WWE partnership with TNA, and the fact that you made your central storyline for that TV show a bit Hulk Hogan giving Abyss the Hall of Fame ring from WWE just shows like WWE's up here, TNA down here, like right off the bat.
Yeah.
It was basically Hulk Hogan featuring wrestlers. That's pretty much what it was, and that's
hmm
what it felt.
And I remember at that time, Richie, because I got back into it, like
Mhm,
watching and everything, because I was able to
mhm.
watch it and everything, because I didn't
Yeah.
have, like I said, my job and everything. And I remember watching it, and I'm like, yo, what the hell happened to the X Division?
Mm,
Like, that was my
yeah.
main thing. I'm like, yo, what happened to the wrestlers that made the X Division? Like, what the hell is this? Like, it really, like you said, it was trying to be WWE light, and then they were like trying to be like
Mhm,
WCW. Like that's how the show had like this weird vibe. Like it tried to be WB light, and then one week it tried to be WCW. Then it was like, well, we're gonna try to be WB, WCW, and ECW all at the same
mhm.
time. Especially with the ECW
Oh yeah, the
Homecoming.
EV 2.0. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, man, this is like, what are you like? Where are you going? Like where, the rhyme and reason. Like, who's this and that. And I remember I told my buddy at that time, and I'm like, man, the problem with TNA is they're not centered on their guy. Like, who's the top
Mhm.
guy there? You don't know who the top
Yeah,
guy
like
is.
you thought. Like for me, it was always AJ. Like AJ was the homegrown
Yeah,
guy,
yeah.
And it's like he's the homegrown guy, and I think like when they went to Spike, he was like already like a 3-time like Triple Crown winner, but still he was the guy. But when Hogan and Bischoff came in, like they didn't know him. You know what I mean? They didn't know him, so it's like, all right, make him Ric Flair Jr.
Oh god,
I'm
that was
like
so
that's not
stupid.
AJ though. That's not. It's like this is how
Yeah, he got the earring and
it's like, remember when people would say when you're in WWE for the longest time, you were playing to an audience of one? That's how it kind of felt. You were playing to
yes,
Hogan and Bischoff and what they wanted in wrestling. Because I remember,
which was even worse than
yeah,
Vince.
oh, yeah, and what even proved because they wouldn't try to incorporate some innovative things like they did the before AEW had a ranking system. TNA had their ranking system, and it's like, oh, it's gonna be voted on by the fans. You know what I mean? Like initially, so who's gonna get a world championship shot? Problem was the person that they wanted to win, which was probably like Jeff Hardy or Rob. Like I think Rob Van Dam was the champ at the time, but like who they wanted, like Jeff Hardy or like somebody like who they wanted to promote. Desmond Wolf, who's Nigel McGuinness, kept winning the poll. So like they got angry at him and they started to bury Nigel because they thought the fans were voting Nigel as a joke when in actuality we wanted to see Nigel McGuinness on on top in
Yeah,
TNA.
you wanted. Yeah, that was like for me, like I remember that period very vividly because it was just like they went away from it's funny because it's like they went away from the
Mhm.
wrestling and they never like went back to it. Even till to this day. Like granted they had Osprey
Yeah.
and everything, but like that core TNA
Mhm.
before Bischoff, like you mentioned earlier, that really connected you. Like they, like people talk about how AEW pivoted in like
Mhm.
2023 and oh they got sports entertainment. They could get away with it with their
Mhm.
roster, but they always centered everything around the
Yeah.
wrestling. And with TNA at that time, they never really centered around what made them. Like you
Mhm.
said, it was like Bischoff and Hogan got in there and they stripped it to the
Mhm.
core. And it was just like, well, what the hell's left? Like, what are we trying to do? And it
Yeah.
just like really what you saw on TV, like it didn't connect because it's like, what
It
is
was a
this?
case of lost identity for TNA, and I feel like
hmm
the one of the biggest things that happened was they tried to recreate what made WCW like popular in the first round, or which is what I complained about earlier in the podcast was it's like let's do the NWO but worse.
The
Yeah, the
band.
band Immortal you could throw in there, Aces and Eights, like you talked
Nasty
about.
Boys.
Like again, just like everything where it's just like, and it got so bad that it's like some of the changes they like got rid of these guys right away. Like there was a point where I think Sean Morley defeated like Christopher Daniels at like Genesis or something. And he was only called Daniels at that time too, so I didn't know why like like they just got rid of the name Chris, but he was like
Yeah,
Daniels.
it was.
And like when Sean Morley beat Daniels, like the entire crowd, since they were in the Impact Zone, turned their back the entire show. Like they stood up, turned their back to the show because they were
I gotta find that
it
episode.
was it's Genesis 2010. So this is like the first pay-per-view
Okay.
right after, like this is the pay-per-view where they switched the ring from 6 sides to 4 sides, and that was show when they're chanting
Yeah.
we want 6 sides. And then Hogan's like, you got 6 sides and only got you like so far. Now you're in the big leads, no playpen
I
ring. And
remember
then like the
this.
crowd is just booing, just like no self-awareness in that. Like it was almost like to the degree of, and these aren't like totally comparable, but it's like when Rock came back last year and everything was fine and hunky dory, and then but it was just a lack of reading the room that you're in, where it's just kind of like you're
Yeah.
not in tune with what the fan base really wants in that moment in time.
Yeah, I know when they changed the ring to 6 sides, I was just like, why? That's what made you
To four
unique.
sides.
I'm like, now you just look a a WCW, like ECW knockoff.
Yeah,
Like there's nothing
and they
unique.
switched the
Because
ring.
that was,
Yeah,
I mean,
they switched to ring ropes
looking
too.
at it visually, yeah, when you changed the channel and you saw TNA with the 6 sided ring, like you stayed because it was just
Yeah.
different. You're like, man, how the first thing you thought of, you're like, man, how the hell are they gonna wrestle in
Hmm.
this? Like, how's the tag? Like, how does this?
Yeah.
So you're like this. You're looking at it, but then once they changed it, it was just like, kind of like the term I always use, like they watered it
Hmm.
down and
Yeah.
normalized it to the point where it just didn't connect. It was just like, oh, this is another wrestling show. That's what
Yeah,
it felt
it
like.
just felt like this isn't WWE. So, this is like trying to be
Yeah,
like WWE when it really shouldn't. If you're focused on trying to be the alternative, you got to do like something different. Shoot it differently. Like look at Lucha Underground. Like during that
yeah.
time period, I remember a lot of Lucha Underground was getting a lot of hype because they were just portraying things differently. And I feel like with TNA, like no one could explain what TNA was, whether it's the office to the new people coming in. They had like it's like what's TNA, and the office like would be like oh this is what it is, but kind of not really this. When they were trying to explain like what the X division is, like Bischoff and Pritchard's like what's the X division, and then the response was always to them was oh it's no limits, and they're like what does that mean? Oh it's just no limits, but it's like I think you and I, we could sit here and we could talk about like what made the X division the X division. So they got frustrated with it. They're like,
Yeah.
all right, now weight limit, nobody under like 220 pounds for the X division,
Yeah, that was
and
another
then it's like
thing.
all matches were triple threat matches, which was a weird that count because I feel like they just saw the Unbreakable match between AJ Daniels and Joe, and they're like, all right,
Mhm.
everything's triple threat matches. And then it's like the qualifiers were all triple threat matches with the title matches being triple threat matches, and like again, just did not
Yeah,
hit.
I remember that uh seeing that type of stuff. Like I was always a big fan of AJ Styles, Petey
Hmm.
Williams, Chris Sabin, Samoa
Yeah,
Joe, um Elix Skipper, America's Most Wanted. Like that core group
yeah.
I was a huge fan of and their work and everything. But when Bischoff and Hogan came, it was like, man, it was I don't want to repeat myself saying weird, but it was just
Hmm.
weird. Like they when you like there was no tempo, and with those guys like AJ Styles and like Petey Williams and Chris
Hmm.
Sabin, their matches, like they would before they came in, they would Jeff Jarrett would give them time, and it was just like they tried to make them caricatures of something that they weren't
They try to make
in a
yeah.
wrestling world that didn't make
They tried
sense.
to make them characters of characters they already knew. You know what I mean? Like they try
Yeah,
to like give them like, all right, well, you're gonna be like Ric Flair, but I'm not Ric Flair. I'm AJ Styles. We don't know who that is, so
yeah,
you're Ric Flair. It's like AJ, to be fair, AJ did play Ric Flair better than the Kerry Von Erich movie or the Von Erich movies.
Oh my god, yes.
So I'll give credit
Yes,
to
that
AJ
was
there.
freaking
And
hilarious.
then
But yeah, I remember they tried to recreate the Horseman with
yeah,
Fortune,
Fortune 4.
and I looked at it, I was like, it would have made more sense if you would have just put what was it? What did I tell my buddy at the time? I was like, it would have made more sense if you would have put AJ, Samoa Joe, Chris Sabin, and Petey
Mhm.
Williams. Like the four guys of the X division. Like
You you
that would have made more sense. Like the guys I had there, I was like, these guys don't even like they don't like,
you know what's even
huh?
better about Fortune? It had more than 4 members. Their name is Fortune.
You're gonna make me spit this
I'm
water
sorry.
out,
I'm
man.
sorry.
This is that was so
I'm
stupid.
sorry, but it's like if your name is Fortune and you have 4, like it's spelled 4 as in the number in the
Yeah,
title, and your logo is the number 4, you expect there would be like there's 4 original members in Flair, like that's fine. I can understand because it's like the JJ Dillon thing with the 4 Horsemen. But it's like
yeah.
when you add like it's okay. It's like AJ, James Storm, Bobby Roode, Kazarian, Doug Williams, Matt Morgan,
Oh my lord.
Daniels.
Oh my
You
god.
know,
And you know what? Another thing about that era, and we haven't touched on it, but it's something that came to my mind while you were
mhm.
talking everything. How, of course, in this time, people are like, oh, Tony Khan always signs all these
Mhm.
XWB guys. My goodness.
That's like
The
oof.
moment someone was released in WWE, they were literally on TNA television like the next week.
Once the 90 days came up, like you were like
Yeah.
it was always a joke. It's still a joke to this day where it's like if somebody gets a release, it's like, "Oh, what's XYZ doing in the impact zone?" Cuz that was always the meme
Yeah.
that was going on. They would just sign it even if you didn't do anything like and this is not to like diminish anybody's like stint in WWE, but even if you didn't do anything noteworthy, like you were on the radar. You know what I mean? Like I remember the
Yeah.
Heartthrobs were one, the Bashams were another, and they were like a couple shot team. But it's like the perception was it's like, oh, you're released from WWE, TNA is probably the most logical landing spot for you. And it was just like, it got fatiguing where it's just like originally like TNA we saw like we saw Christian jump over, we saw like Kurt jump
Hmm.
over, we saw Booker
Booker.
come over, we saw Raven come over, we saw like all these different guys come over. It's like, oh, that makes sense because it's like they weren't given like the proper shot. In Angle's case, it was used to boost the profile, like how Sting did for TNA. But
Yeah.
then it's like sooner or later you saw more and more of these guys to the point where it's just like, did we really need like this person in here? Did we really need Orlando Jordan? Like all due respect to Orlando Jordan, but it's like he
I actually like that
I
gimmick.
thought it was a pretty intriguing gimmick, with the yeah.
They just really didn't go with it because, of course,
I think they got
it's
cold feet on it.
you know,
They really got cold feet on it
yeah,
because I think they were
because I
afraid.
think it was before its
Yeah,
time. Because
yeah,
if you really look at it, that gimmick was almost you could say
yeah,
precursor to Iffy.
yeah. You know,
So it's like you could have
yeah.
done something, but it was
It
just
was just
like,
kind of like
oh well, they're
what I
not gonna
think
do anything
that
with it.
because Orlando Jordan wanted to do a similar gimmick in WWE, but it's kind of like just signing Orlando Jordan, where it's like in 2010, where it's just like okay, it's like what like because he could have like done something like you said, where it's just like you go with this gimmick and it could be like a modern day version of like a Gold Dust or something, but then you turn it into a comedy pairing with Eric Young, and all due respect, but it's just like that's not where it's like you're just signing people just to sign people, not to promote them
Yeah,
as their own individuals.
you know what? It brings to mind of how people now in 2025 complain about guys being called or wrestlers being called up to the main
Yeah,
roster in WWE and not having any
yeah,
plans. Like that's what TNA would sign people, and you're like, okay,
yeah.
what are they
Like they
doing?
did
Like
Damien
why?
Sandow too when he became Aaron Rex. And then it's just like
Yeah,
everyone kind of had a formula. If you weren't used properly in the fan base's mind in WWE, they would all like cut the same promo, WWE bad, and then it's like I'm gonna show them like XYZ why they should have used me more as an I told you so. But then it's like you didn't like majority like not everyone's gonna be world champion or in a better position when they left WWE. Like
yeah.
I'm sorry, it's just
It's
not
like,
going to happen. It's
huh?
where it's just like like it just didn't really connect with me. Like then like Aaron Rex became like a Liberace gimmick for a little bit,
I remember
and then
that. I
like
remember that.
Rockstar Spud was his guy for a little bit. And like I was just like,
Yeah, it was just really. I think the other thing that, and you've said it, you've mentioned it a lot, and I think if there was a word that you could associate with TNA, and I know we got more to
yeah,
talk about, is lack of self
hmm
awareness. Because I don't think they realize, like, hey, most of the big cities in America at that time only were able to watch WB and
hmm
TNA. Like, we, like, unless you were, like, here in Chicago, like, unless you were, like, downstate or you had some type of
hmm
hookup, you didn't get
hmm
ROH. ROH wasn't broadcast.
yeah,
Again, it was going
yeah.
on then, but you didn't get it. So you would think someone in the office would be like, "Hey, I think we need to tighten up the
Mhm.
screws here because like we're looking
Yeah,
really bad."
like ROH
And
was on HD net at that point.
yeah, and it was just like, what are they doing? And that was my complaint too. I'm like, why did you sign this
Mhm.
person? Like, why? Let them go to Japan or Mexico or something. Like, why?
There were so many missed opportunities because like you had people like Moxley, Cabana, who else worked dark matches? I think Rollins,
Um, you know who else was there? And I
Jericho
didn't
too. Yeah,
realize this till this week. Hiroshi
yeah, he was
Tanahashi.
there. He was there. I think he faced AJ at a pay per view like in '06 or something,
Yeah,
and that's when
yeah. I'm
Shan
trying to
Moore
think
was
of
the Prince
who
of
else.
Punk. Uh,
Yeah, there was a few others. It's just like you
like
had a
I
crop
think the
of
Briscoes at
wrestlers,
one
but
point
you,
too, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, I think
Yeah, so
so.
it's like you had all these talents and they ended up going elsewhere or just stayed in ROH because it's just like they were like, nope, pass. And then WWE kind of like took the scraps when they were on their indie hiring run and then like turned them to
It's
stars.
just like, whoop, come on in.
And
Yeah, I know my buddy, man, God rest his
mhm,
soul, my buddy KG, he would say, like, man, I wish it was
mhm.
funny. We were in broadcast ago, and he's like, man, I wish ROH and TNA could switch places. Because he's like, ROH has the better, like, wrestling product and just story and
Mhm.
everything. And he's like, TNA needs to be where ROH, like, they need to swap.
Yeah.
It's like, this is freaking
Yeah,
horrible.
they also, do you remember
But yeah,
Feast or
it was,
Fired?
yes, I do remember
So
that.
if you guys don't know what Feast or Fired is, basically it's like a four corner pole match that's essentially Money in the Bank, where it's battle royal, but four briefcases that contain a world title shot, X Division title shot, tag title shot, and you're fired briefcase. So pretty much like they used it as like a gimmick for a couple of years where it's just like it was just Chris Daniels where it's like he became Curry Man because Chris Daniels got fired.
Yeah.
So they did that. But there was actually a really jacked up story and it involves Chavo Guerrero. I'm not sure if you know this. So they did Feast or Fired.
Ooh, refresh my
So they did
memory.
Feast or Fired and Chavo got the fired briefcase, right? So Chavo was under impression it's like, all right, it's creative plan. So it's like I'll stay home and then they'll call me. But they actually tried to like legit fire him from his contract. And he's like, "No, I have a contract here. Like, you're gonna pay me what I'm owed. You're not just gonna
Yeah.
release me from my contract." So it was just like one of
Oh,
those
my
things where
Lord.
it's just like they settled it eventually as they should, but it's just like I just find it funny. I know they didn't intend it, but it's like you won the feast or fire. You've won the fired briefcase legitimately, and they're just trying to like not pay you the
Oh,
duration of the
my
contract.
Lord. Yeah, I know that when you listen to people who were there at that time, like I know Bruce Pritchard talked about the Feast or Fired. I can't remember if Cornette was still there. I think Kevin
Mhm.
Nash talked about it, but whenever, mostly Bruce Pritchard, whenever they talk about, like, the concept is pretty, like, oh wow, that's pretty interesting. But it was always the
Mhm.
execution that it was just like was wonky.
Yeah.
Like it just didn't make sense. Like when I saw it, I was like, man, Feast or Fire. I'm like, man, that's actually pretty creative. But the way they
Mhm.
executed, the way they stood in the ring and like, okay, let's see what your briefcase says, and it's just like, okay, it's like, oh, you're
Mhm.
fired, and then they just walk out. I'm like, what type of
Yeah,
stuff? Like, what is
no
this?
angle, no nothing. No one wants to see somebody gets
No, it was
fired.
just very
No one
dry.
wants to see somebody like get fired, whether it's a storyline or not, on national television.
Yeah. Then what would make it worse? And I remember watching one episode when they did it. Like the crowd just was
Hmm
quiet. Like it was just no. I'm like, man. And I think. if you remember, like that was one of my biggest criticisms in my post that I had. Like most of the stuff that TNA did, the crowd wasn't
Mhm.
reacting; they were just there, and I'm just like, man, this may. I'm like, man, let me watch Jersey Shore. Let me go watch something else. Like, man, this freaking thing's boring, man. Let me find something else.
Speaking of like interesting idea but poor execution, do you remember the gut check challenge?
Yes, because it was kind of like a spin-off of the Feast and Fire, if I
So
remember
pretty much what they would do is
correctly.
like it would be like a 2 week process where it was like 1 week you'll have two unsigned guys have a match on TNA television. And then the next week you'll have three judges, which is usually headed by Al Snow, Bruce Pritchard, and it was Ric Flair, but but then it switched to Taz because the one Ric Flair was a part of. The plan was they didn't want to hire this guy. I believe his name was Alex Silva, and it was going to be like, all right, it's going to be a no, like we're just going to be a no, so it adds realism that it's like, oh, not everyone's going to get hired off this process. So they agreed ahead of time. It's like no, 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 no. So Flair says no. I think Snow says yes. Um, and then they're like, all right, you get 30 seconds to cut a promo. So Alex Silva cuts this promo, and Flair grabs the mic and he says, I changed my answer to yes. So then so then TNA has to
Oh my
hire
lord!
him because Flair changed his answer live
Oh my
to
lord!
hire this guy.
Oh my
And Flair
lord!
doesn't
I
care.
remember. I remember the gut check. I can't remember what famous people were there.
Sam
Somebody that
Shaw
was
was a
famous
gut
was on.
check winner.
Yeah,
Christian York, they turned down Brian Cage.
yeah. I remember. I think Bailey was in one of the gut checks.
I think I would buy it, because I they did have
Yeah,
female and male gut checks, but it's like then that spun off into like they would host like gut check tryouts, so that's became their tryout name, and I think they did
yeah,
British boot camp off of that because TNA had a huge like fan base in Europe, and I remember Bischoff saying that he was pushing really hard for TNA to tape in Europe just because it's like the vibe there would be better, but they like
yeah,
the office just wasn't interested.
yeah. I remember. Did they do a show there
They
eventually?
did like a whole host of tapings in there.
Yeah, I remember seeing those tapes and it was like, yo, this is. I'm like, just stay over
Yeah,
there. Do not come
yeah,
back. Stay over there. Make whatever you do. Stay. Like I like the vibe and everything. And then like it was just night and
mhm,
day, and it was just like,
yeah,
man, this is. Yeah, I
yeah.
think around 2014 is when like just stopped watching. Where I was just like, I'm sorry, this is just.
Once AJ left, that's when I jumped ship. you know,
Yeah, I think that you know what that was. You could say I don't want to say the death kneel, but that was like I mean it's overdue using this term, end of an
Mm.
era. But like when he left, like the heart and
I was
soul
about to say the
and the
same thing.
backbone of
Yeah,
the company just left. Like it just left and was just
yeah.
like,
They ripped that off.
oh,
Like,
AJ ain't there. Like,
yeah. Then you saw like Daniels leave, Kazarian leave, Joe leave. Like that
yeah,
2014 year, you saw like all these like TNA originals just leave. And AJ was,
yeah. And
yeah,
then you had some of the WWE guys go back to
yeah,
WWE. So it was like it's this exodus of like, okay, I'm going to Ring of Honor, New Japan, or
hmm
WWE, and it just spread out that way. And then TNA was just like, I remember I tuned in on one man. I actually missed that era of Destination America of freaking it was TNA or Impact, Ring of Honor, and Lucha Underground. Man, that was a sweet
yeah,
3 hours. Oh man, that was sweet.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I noticed the difference of at that time you're talking about like 2014, 2015 of Ring of Honor and TNA, and I'm like, yo, Ring of Honor's like my type of
hmm
wrestling. I don't know what the hell they're trying to do in TNA. A Ring of Honor, this is
hmm
pretty cool. And I think that's when the shift happened where it just like I mentioned earlier, like TNA was already by 2008, 9 with Vince Russo's creative, like it was going
hmm
down. Freaking Hogan and Bischoff just and then by that time they was just floating above.
Yeah.
Like it was just, oh, we're just
Yeah, it's
here.
just like we're content with being content. where it's just like, well, we're
Yeah.
content with just like being passable or a little bit, where it's just like, man, you guys were the alternative. Like the hype that AEW had when it first debuted on TNT was there were a lot of people in like who were TNA fans were like as hyped for that, like for TNA.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's like you had like this untapped market where it's just like there was so much potential to be the alternative and get these indie guys. And they were listening to the fan base online and they had, the internet at their fingertips and could try to like progressively move that way. But they just decided it's like, no, we have to be just like WWE. In fact, another great moment was the VKM tag team, Voodoo Kin Mafia, which was Kip James, BG James, also known as the New Age Outlaws, and
Oh Lord.
their whole storyline was like sticking it to WWE. And one of the best things was the Hardys, I believe, had an open challenge at December to Dismember, which was answered by Eminem. Let's see. Then they accepted it. Of course, WWE is not going to acknowledge it because why would they? And
Yeah.
they actually challenged. They used their real names, so it's like Paul Levesque and Michael Hickenbottom, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, to a quote unquote real fight, and they'll put $1 million on the line. And the kicker is Dixie Carter legitimately set aside $1 million because she thought there was a good chance that this fight would actually take place. And this was during a time where TNA
Oh Lord.
was stopped covering for travel and hotels for their talent. So you're setting aside $1 million, but the rest of your talent is just like not happening. And Dixie, like this is years down the line, where it's like she gave a speech about, you know, like stepping up and just like, look, it's like you got to change up, shape up, and if you want to, and if you just want to leave, just go. Like you're not. This is a team effort. I think like Senshi low key actually left. Like after that, he just like son of a
Yeah,
bitch.
it's I would have left
Yeah.
too. Yeah, that was I vividly remember VKM. And like I said earlier, like they were trying, and you know what? I think what it was back at that time, just to give some historical
Yeah.
context of it, because I think I was watching
Yeah.
before you, right? Okay, to give you like the vibe of just wrestling and just pop culture at that time, like there wasn't really people in the business that were like business sharp as far as, all right, let's a clear
Yeah.
alternative. Like we're not trying to be WWE or A or WCW, ECW. We're just going to be an
Hmm.
alternative. And it was almost like, again, they bought Russo in, and it was almost like you had these guys that were in WCW and ECW that were upset that Vince bought out the company. So they were performing with this axe to grind, not hey, let's entertain the
Hmm.
fans and be creative and create something new. So it was like they were performing with like this
Yeah.
bitterness, and it shows if you watch those it shows with
Yeah.
that product.
I can honestly say like I've gotten consistent headaches watching TNA, and it's not because it's like sometimes I just couldn't watch the product because it's just like the storylines would hurt. I remember they aired the same MCMG vignette against Beer Money. Like it was the same segment. Like one was in April and the other one was in October. And I'm just like they just reused this entire segment, like this whole like
Yeah,
PSA, the dangers of beer and money, and they used it like
yeah.
months apart. I'm like, it's the same exact segment, like the same vignette, where it's like a sicko like me, like I remember all this, where I'm like, why does this look so familiar? And then that happened.
It's like, wait a minute, let me go back and yeah, it was man that time period, and that was the one thing that was disappointing. That's why, like, granted, to bring some context in this, like you didn't have streaming service or anything
Mhm.
like that, so you still had, and that's like this is very important with this discussion we're having is TNA was still, and actually television as a whole was still in the
Yeah.
analog phase. It wasn't in a digital
Hmm.
phase. So you still had the Nelson ratings as far as
Like
TV
yeah,
ratings and
like
stuff
what's
like that.
working and stuff.
So like yeah, so it was just like people just got disinterested with wrestling. That's where you saw like WWE's
Mhm,
numbers. Granted, they were making record profits,
mhm.
but like their numbers dropped, and TNA, just what they were presenting was just
Mhm.
like, you
Yeah,
know what, I'll watch, and it's a parallel between that and the rise of the
mhm.
UFC and MMA,
Absolutely.
where people just started shifting, and it just skyrocketed. It's like, well, you're putting on freaking a mediocre
Mhm.
product, and you got one company that's, the freaking guy running it thinks he's the Julius Caesar of wrestling, and then you got freaking TNA that, well, we couldn't do what we did in WCW because standard and
Yeah,
practices. We couldn't do what we did in ECW because of the
yeah.
budget. And it's like,
Basically, it was like,
you couldn't
yeah,
do what you did in TNA was just
yeah, it
garbage.
basically became like, we're gonna out WWE, and that was the wrong mentality
Yeah.
to have.
Oh my lord. It was so me and my buddy. And what's interesting about you bringing that up, they brought out, or WWE released the Monday Night War
Mhm.
DVD. And this was 2004 that they released it and everything. And me and my buddy from high school, we watched it and we're like, mind you, this is just a logical thing. Mind you, this is 2004, so I'm 22 years old. Me and my buddy are like, why isn't anyone in the wrestling industry using this video as like a template to compete with WWE? Like
Mhm.
literally in the video, Eric Bischoff's like, I had this piece of paper, drew a down line, drew down the line, and I'm like, okay, what does WWE do? Let's do the opposite. What does WWE do? We do the opposite. And it's like, you could literally do that right
Yeah.
now. Like it's there. And it was just like they were so stuck on trying to recapture what they didn't finish in
Mhm.
WCW or ECW that it was a very
Yeah.
problematic like
It
promotion.
really just kind of felt like, again, finishing the story has been like a whole meme and stuff at this point. It was a promotion with a bunch of guys who were coming into TNA to finish a story that was already finished, and they didn't realize
Yes.
they already finished that story. It's like they were trying to write the
Yes.
unnecessary sequel to an already like ending that already had a bow on it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it,
You know what? That's a very accurate
mm,
statement.
because it's just kind of like, you're no one, like, after like Cinderella, after any fairy tales like happily ever after, and it goes, what happened next? Where it's just
Yeah.
like, it's like, no, unless you had something like a continuation, like a Christian Cage, like a Kurt Angle, like a Sting,
Yeah.
where it's just kind of like, okay, we get to see like them just like in this new kind of environment. But a lot of people were just trying to recapture the magic and do things the same way they did 10, 15 years ago. And it just didn't connect with the audience. And I feel like wrestling during that time period was, and I joke about this with WWE all the time, where it's like, if something was popular 6 months ago, WWE's just finding out about it now. You
Yeah.
know, w-
I can attest to that, what you're saying at that time, because there was like the X division when that took off, that's when they started pushing more Eddie Guerrero, um, Rey Mysterio,
Mhm.
Billy Kidman. That's when they brought back the Cruiserweight
Mm,
Championship. So it's like, oh, they're doing the X division. We're gonna bring back the
yeah.
Cruiserweight, and it was just like, ah, okay, you're paying attention. And it was, man, it's for me, it's sad because I remember, mind you, this was my early
Mhm.
20s, so I'm coming off the whole Monday Night War
Yeah.
thing in high school and everything, and I'm like, dude, like literally the basis of the Monday Night War aspect from WCW's point of view and Bischoff's point of view was basically whatever WWE is doing, do the opposite. That was the basic thing, and I'm like, how did you screw this up? You can see, the opposite, that you could do at that time. And I mean, you had two champions, you had two shows. It was very dramatic, promo
Mhm.
heavy at that time. It's like, dude, go wrestling, like just wrestle.
Mhm.
And it again, like you said, by the time you saw it, it was even more WWE
Yeah.
light. But it was like they were. I want to say like 2005, six is when they really started leaning into like that WWE light stuff.
Yeah. It really did seem like they were trying to it's almost like to describe it a little bit as I'm trying to get my words out. It's like, in high school you see the person that's kind of dressed up and they're like, they're trying to be different, but it's not them. That's
Yeah,
pretty much what TNA tried to be as it went
yeah,
on. It was like, you look at it, they look different. It could look cool, but I'm like, this ain't you. You're just doing it because you
yeah,
think it's going to get a reaction, not because you're listening to yourself and what you think is cool. You're listening to all these other people and what they think is cool. And with TNA, it was more like, how can we compete with WWE? And never, how can we be the best product possible? And that's pretty much what kind of like caused their whole entire downfall, in my opinion.
yeah. When you brought up Robbie E, I remember the episode, like one episode he came out, and mind you, I was a big fan of like Jersey Shore at the time because it was just freaking
Oh,
hilarious
it's great.
and everything. And then like when he comes out, I'm like, oh my lord, like really, like this is the depth of your creative that you're creating a ripoff from a popular TV show that it's not even like like wrestling always copies from different types of media,
Yeah.
like they'll allude to it. Like the Road
Mhm.
Warriors were, alluding to like Mad Max and
Yeah.
everything, which is like, all right, cool, but
Still made it
they
their own,
made their own
like
path.
Razor
Yeah,
Ramon and Scarface, Sting and
Scarface, and it's
Crow.
like, yeah, but it's like Robbie E. I'm like, dude, he has the hair up. He's
Yeah,
doing
he's doing the
this.
fist pump. Yeah, and
I'm like, yo, I can't. I'm
it
like,
was the
I
definition
can't do
of,
this.
you can copy my homework, just make sure the words are different.
Yeah, it was just like, what? And it's disappointing because like when you look back, you had so much talent, and that's why till this day when people say like, "Oh, AEW's like 10," I'm like, no, you didn't live during that. Trust me, you didn't live during that time period. Like, granted, there are some things with AEW that you can critique and
Absolutely,
everything,
yeah.
but the depth of where TNA was and where AEW, like, no,
No, which is why when
no,
people like, it's funny because I have this one of my buddies, Seth. He was on the podcast a couple of times. He'll always watch, and I joke with this about him all the time. He'll always watch AEW when like it's the worst possible thing to watch. Where it's like he turned on AEW one day. He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna give it a chance." It was like the Jeff Hardy, Jeff Jarrett Leatherface match. Yeah, so,
okay,
so he's like, what are we doing here? I'm just like, it's like one of those things where it's like, you're watching like an anime or a TV show, and it's like,
yeah,
no, but once you get to like episode 5, that's when it really gets good. And then it's like you're watching it, it's like,
yeah,
are you kidding? This sucks right now. It's like, trust me on this, and you gotta have to like, you hope they take you at your word to make it believable. But with TNA, it was just more like they're just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping to see something sticks. When you saw the trend, like the knockouts were crushing it, where it's just like, hey, let's try to promote this a little bit
yeah,
more. You got Gail Kim, Awesome Kong, all this, and then you made like just divas. You just made divas to the point where WWE started ripping off some of TNA's angles, where it's like, you had the beautiful
yes,
people, you had Lay Cool. You know what I mean? They
yep.
even took Claire Lynch. They
No, I mean, everything you're saying, and anybody who listens to this and watches this, like, you are spot on. Like, I was watching at the time, I'm like, like, going back to the Monday Night War, and even before that in the 80s, like, there were things that, like, WWE would copy from other
Mhm,
promotions, the
mhm,
Road Warriors,
mhm,
Demolition, like, that
mhm.
whole thing. I'm like, yeah, I see the thing. And, I remember with the beautiful people in Lake Cool, I'm like, yeah, they're copying, like, and for me as a wrestler, I'm like, okay, if TNA, like, do they realize that WWE's copying them? And if WWE's copying, maybe there's something that you have that's working. And the things that would work, they wouldn't
Mhm.
continue. And the things that wouldn't work, they would continue. And it's like an oxymoron. I'm like, what are you?
It's almost like once WWE started
Why?
copying what was working with TNA, that's when TNA would stop it or crush the gimmick like dead, even though it's like, I'm like, but you
Yeah.
originated this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, make it your own. Like, right now, like, the whole thing with Harley
Mhm.
Cameron
She's
and
great.
everything. Like, I don't think maybe WWE can copy that, but it's gonna be a real hard thing to copy
Yeah,
that talent.
it's really hard, and I already saw people say, "Oh, she's the female Joe Hendry," and I'm just kind of like, she has a guitar. Other people have had guitars before, Not only
Yeah,
that,
she's a
and,
ventriloquist. That's even
and she
freaking.
and
That's
she
another
speaks
level.
fluent Chinese too, which I'm just
Yes,
like, that is just
yes, yeah. It's when you brought up Okada and like the Green Lantern and everything. Like one thing that I noticed about man, I can't. I don't even know if. Damn it! I wish I would have had my what I said about TNA at that time that I
Mhm,
showed you. But one of the things I remember vividly, one of the serious my critique was serious, but like one of the things that main points that I noticed was I noticed that they really didn't emphasize sense of
mhm.
urgency, aggression, intensity, and hostility as far as their
Right.
feuds. It just felt like you were watching like a Target version of wrestling.
Like you're watching the wrestlers play wrestler instead of being wrestler.
Yeah. Like there wasn't like even like if you really think about it at that time, the only feuds that really had like intensity were like Sting and Jeff Jarrett at when Sting came back with the
Mhm.
colorful face
Then you
paint,
had like Angle and
um
Joe.
Angle and Joe, the X Division match between was it AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, and Chris
Should
Sabian?
be. I
I
think it was
believe
Joe.
so. Or
Yeah.
Joe. You know, that like there's very few matches that you could say, man, there was just some like legitimate intensity. And it's just like I mean, they tried to be more sports
Mhm.
entertainment than WWE instead of being pro
Yeah, well,
wrestling.
we're gonna out sports entertain you instead of being like, hey, let's actually emphasize professional
Yeah.
wrestling a little bit more, which got us off the ground in the first place.
Yeah.
And another thing about like what when they got away from that, one of the big things, like they pretty much cut ties with any promotion they were doing partnerships with. Like, uh, let's see, I'm trying to think. Like New Japan was one, AAA was another one, and one of the big things that severed the Japan relationships, New Japan, was not only the Okada treatment, like I mentioned before, but they had a match
Hmm.
where British Invasion defeated the Dudleys or Team 3D for the IWGP Tag Team Championships, and Japan takes their title reigns really seriously, and
Oh
they
yeah.
didn't consult New Japan about the change, so they wouldn't officially recognize it. But and then an agreement was shortly after that, and then they just cut ties from there, along with NWA, because remember TNA, they were an NWA kind of territory promotion,
Yeah.
so they had the NWA championship, they had the NWA tag titles, NWA X Division title, things like that, and so how the process was. I think Christian was the champion at the time, so they had like the physical belt, but referred to it as like the world championship. And then how it happened was like Sting rolled up Christian, and then Kurt had Sting in the ankle lock. Sting tapped. Two referees saw like the pin and the submission, and then Kurt's the champion, but not really. And then the next day, like he's still champion. Oh, but there was controversy, so we're gonna vacate it. And everyone's favorite TNA match, the King of the Mountain match. I forgot to talk about this one. So the King of the Mountain match,
Oh yes. I
it's a reverse.
earlier I was like, man, I remember the King of the Mountain match because that was one match I really did
Yeah, it
not
was a
like.
reverse ladder match basically, where it's like it's five guys, not the restaurant, but five guys, where it's you get a pinfall or submission in order to gain eligibility to hang the championship up, and whoever gets pinned gets put in a penalty box for 2 minutes, and then after that, it's like the people who only get the pin would be able to hang the championship up. And if you hang the championship up, then you are the king of the mountain and you are the new champion, allegedly. But the thing is, it's just like I'm like, man, this whole thing can't work. And then NXT does the Iron Survivor Challenge. I'm like, oh wow, they actually made the penalty box actually work in that kind of match. But like
Yeah.
King of the Mountain, it was like that. There was the Dixieland match where it was it was a steel cage that you had to climb out of. and then there was a ladder on the ramp that you had to climb and retrieve the championship.
Man, that was one of my pet peeves with TNA was like they would create these stipulation matches, and I remember this vividly because I'm like, okay, this you're trying to be creative, but I'm like, you're doing too much. Like my buddy watched it one time, and he's like, so wait a minute, they have to do, and he's like, can they simplify this? Because like this is too
Right.
like this is complicated to the point where it's like, I don't care, let's watch
Yeah.
something else. Like it's just over complicating
If it
things.
takes you more than 5 seconds to understand the concept, then it's like it's going to be too confusing for everybody who's just tuning in and watching. You know what I mean? If it
Yeah.
takes you like if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, like then concept's not
Yes.
really worth
Yes.
like doing. It's just
Yeah.
it's just
It.
adding stuff for the sake of dressing.
Yeah. Like I was like my buddy from high school when we were watching TNA. Like he started watching wrestling like
Mhm.
'99, 2000. So he was more at it like late Attitude
Yeah.
Era thing. Not Monday Night War, WCW and
Right.
WWE, but more
Right.
Attitude Era and everything. So I had to let him know. I'm like, dude, there's so many match types they can do from like the NWA. Why are you doing this crazy stuff when you can, like, if you really think about it, back then they could have done the bull rope
Yeah. Yeah.
matches. They could have done 2 out of 3 falls, which they
Mhm.
rarely. I know. I remember them doing a few times, but not as much as they
So
should have.
you unlocked another memory because I had Bald Bro on the podcast and we talked about 2019 WWE and we had the
Oh,
two out of three falls match era because the person in charge didn't want to do wrestling during the commercial breaks, so every match was a 2 out of 3 falls match.
I remember
It
that.
was
I remember that 2019, and thank the Lord that we got AEW in
I
2019 because
was
it's like, oh my
I've never
Lord.
been like so numb watching WWE before. I'm trying to remember anything close. Probably the guest host era was also like creatively, I was like kind of like done with it.
Yeah,
Where it's like the same rotation
that
of
was just
Triple H, like John Cena, Randy Orton, Edge, just like always on top of the card. Taker, Shawn, and then it's just like, hey, let's put the championship on Jack Swagger. I'm just like, all right, I'm gonna head out a little bit.
yeah. It was when like with the X division. Going back to that, like again, I remember the inception of the X division and seeing it in its early
Mhm.
stages with AJ and those
Yeah,
guys,
Jerry Lynn
um,
even.
and just seeing it evolved and everything. And I was just thinking, I'm like, mind you, this was at the time I was just like, man, like the X division should be main
Mhm.
eventing.
Yeah.
Like it was almost like the way the crowd was behind the X division. It was almost like you need to swap the X division for the world
Hmm.
title. Like have the X division title be the TNA
Hmm.
title, and have the world title be like the international
Hmm.
title or something like that.
I feel
Because it was just,
yeah, yeah.
hmm?
I just like I just kind of feel like the X division kind of like this is your secondary championship, or like you're right here, like we treat you like the cruiserweight championship when they did the option C rule. And I was just like, I don't mind
Yeah,
option C, but it was just kind of like vacating a championship to go after the other championship just seems like this is the important championship and this is just the stepping stone title.
yeah. And that's an old school
Mhm.
thing that they used to do in the back in the mid
Yeah.
'90s, and of course the '80s and before. But yeah, it was just like, man, all these stories bring back so many memories of just how you can, you know what, you can honestly say from like 2002 to like 2019 was kind of like the dark ages of
Hmm.
wrestling.
Eh,
Actually, no, not 2019. Go to like 2013 because that was Bullet Club ROH. So
yeah,
yeah,
like
go
we were
there.
still feasting good, but ironically it wouldn't be on television; it'd be on like streaming and stuff like that. Because
Yeah,
there are a lot of creative things like with TNA and people. I'm not even sure if like we can consider this like in the worst of TNA section because like the Hardy stuff was very innovative for the time with the whole cinematic
yeah.
stuff.
That, you know what? I remember my buddy. I was doing a radio show. I had a radio show at an internet radio station, and my buddy's like, "Dude, did you see the Ultimate
Right.
Deletion?" I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Dude, you need to watch this thing." I'm like, "Man, that looks hokey." He's like, "No, you need to watch this. This is." He's like, "It's stupid funny, but good." So we put it on in the station, And I'm like, I'm so glad I saw this. This is freaking amazing. I'm like, this is good. And the only reason I like tuned in to TNA back then was just because of the Hardys. Like I didn't want to see anything else. Like, dude, I just want to see this. So you know what? We do got to give the Hardys credit for introducing modern wrestling to the cinematic
Mhm.
match and everything because they are the pioneers of that. Because that was really innovative at its time.
Right.
Remember correctly, what year was it that Paul Heyman was in talks with TNA?
2010, like 2009, 2010.
Yeah, because I think that was before Bischoff and
Yeah.
Hogan. And I remember reading that one of the stipulations he wanted was, all right, if you want me to bring me in. I'll have uh, creative control, and everything, head of
Mhm.
creative. But I'm gonna release all these old guys. I'm gonna focus on building new
Right.
guys. And I remember Dixie Carter's like, no, that's not gonna happen. It's like, I think you should have done what he wanted to do because it would have been a lot better.
Absolutely. Oh boy, but we talked for a little bit now. I think this might be a part tour. We need multiple parts going over all these things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because I know that I feel like in the back of my, I'm like, man, there's some other stuff that like I missed. Like I remember watching, I'm like, man, like I got to jog my memory and like recap what it
Yeah.
is. But man, this was
Yeah.
fun. This was back during memory lane and um, just reminiscing like in my early 20s of just how the wrestling industry
Yeah.
was and
Just like the evolution
um,
of it too.
just pop culture in
Yeah,
general
that's the thing.
and everything.
So, all right, we're gonna wrap it up right here. There's definitely gonna be a part two. D, thank you so much for coming. Do your plugs.
No problem, man. I had fun. It's always fun reminiscing on wrestling that I
Yeah.
experienced, and it's fun for
Yeah.
me to share with you because I know you're
Yeah.
younger than me, and it's fun to share with you to provide context,
Yeah.
like someone that was living during that time, and then I like it
Mhm.
because the time that I wasn't watching it,
Yeah.
you were watching it, so I get to
Yeah.
like, okay, now I
We
see,
get to fill
like,
in the
all
blanks
right, I really
together.
wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm recollecting. I was like, you know what? I really didn't miss anything.
You're a firm.
But
Yeah.
no, it's I yeah, but you know what? I always like that, and I hope people nowadays, especially with everything that's going on in the
Mhm.
world, like this is what wrestling's all
Yeah.
about. Like, it don't matter like age or anything like that. If you're
Yeah.
older than some wrestling fans, just chat up, and then it's like, oh man, this is all right. This is cool and everything.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's all like whether you like something or don't like something. This whole common crazy world of wrestling, it's always going to like envelop all of that. It's like as long as just professional wrestling, just like if you like sports entertainment, if you like both, doesn't matter. We've all been on this crazy journey together of fandom, and it's
Yeah,
constantly evolving, which is the crazy thing. And it's just like it's always cool hearing other people's perspective stories when they got in, if they're an old fan, new fan, lapsed fan. So it's always cool to see that.
yeah.
But D, thank you so much
I got
for
I got
everything.
an idea
Ooh, we
for
like
you
ideas.
before we
Yeah.
finish. I got an
Let's
idea.
let's hear it.
We should do one of the wrestling boom and Monday Night War.
Ooh, that might be a whole series.
I can do that one
Yeah.
with you because that's from my
Mhm.
childhood till I was the Monday Night War ended 2021, so I was
Yeah.
19.
Yeah. So
So I got a good 19
yeah.
years of like stuff that I can recall like the back of my
Yeah.
head and everything.
Well, let's do it. But I feel like maybe we'll do two. Maybe we'll call in some guests. But it's gonna be a whole giant experience, and I can't wait to relive that, or not even relive it. I didn't watch the Monday Night Wars, so I get to learn things like first person style. So that's gonna be pretty cool. But
Oh yeah.
yeah, D, thank you so much for joining. Tell everybody where we could find you, what you do, and what platforms you're on.
Oh man. Thank you, brother. Man, you guys can find me City of Wrestling. That's CityofWrestling. You can find City of Wrestling on Facebook, X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and of course, the headquarters of YouTube. You can find me there. You can follow me on pretty much all social media platforms at Dedrin _180. City of Wrestling. If you haven't watched wrestling in a long time or don't have time to watch, just check it out. Richie, you've been through that Instagram story, and that's a plethora of any wrestling that's going
Yeah,
on in the world.
it's a good like just encapsulation on like the TLDR version of like, all right, what's going on? Like what shows happen, like what's going on in wrestling. Just it's a really like neat little thing. It's like, oh, if I don't have time, I could just go on City of Wrestling and just like see what's going on, not only in the major promotions, but the independent promotions as well, and just kind of get the whole wrestling vibe going.
Yeah, thank you. It's a journey covering 66 wrestling promotions. And yes, I'm legit following and covering 66 wrestling
Yeah,
promotions.
so again, if you want to if you are interested in following any of those 66 wrestling promotions, go right to City of Wrestling description, and the link will be in the bio for all of your stuff, D. And this has been,
Man, thank you,
yeah, of
man.
course, man. It's like we're here to raise each other up, we're not here to cut any legs off. We're always here because wrestling fans, if one of us gets to the top, all of us got to the top. But
Yes.
this has been
Yes.
this edition of Wrestling Retold and Relive with Richie Mars. I, of course, am Richie Mars. You can check us out on the Instagram, the TikTok, and the YouTube. And yeah, I have X, but I don't really use it. But you can check us all there. It's at Retold Richie Mars. And again, I'm Richie Mars, and new episodes every Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. So TTFN, Tata for now, and we will see you next time.